our final presentation this morning. We are going to take a look at how to make climate action work for farmers. To do this, we are joined by a panel of local experts who will share their knowledge on the various components of the climate change mitigation and how it can be adapted positively by the agriculture industry. First is Adam McLean. He's a shepherd stewarding flock and land in the hills of South Melville PEI. He's also the Agriculture Climate Action Specialist with the PEI Department of Agriculture and Land. In that capacity, he works with government and industry to develop and deliver programs that support farmers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase carbon sequestration, and increase farm agro-ecosystem reliance on climate change. Matt Ramsey is an active farmer and agriculture consultant. Off-farm research interests centers around integrating quality-assured farm data with on-farm practices in order to achieve measurable ecosystem services, such as carbon sinking. Matt's current on-farm managed priorities center around low-carbon farming and a graduated adoption of best management practices, such as cover cropping, longer rotation, reduced nutrient usage, reduced tillage, agroforestry, and rotational grazing. Thomas Bagelow is a professional forester with experience across both government and the private sector. Through his company, Eastern Forest Solutions, Thomas works with private woodlot owners, large landowners, and other clients through the Maritime provinces and beyond to develop his high-quality, sustained forest management programs. His company is advising and supporting the Sustainable Forest Alliance and up-and-coming cooperative of PEI forest owners to provide high-quality services to woodlot owners, including carbon offset projects, project development, and sales. Sebastian Mango is a founder of Double Hill Cidery in Caledonia in conjunction with the PEI Organic Producers Cooperative. He has been exploring the potential of carbon markets for island producers. So I'll ask them to come forward.
Want to get her started? All right, good morning. I'm going to get things started with some brief remarks, kind of introducing the panel and setting up climate action in the context of island agriculture. And then we'll turn it over to everybody else discussing offset opportunities, pathways to reduce emissions. First of all, putting climate action in context. What is it? It's two sets of actions, a two-pronged approach to address climate change challenges, mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation includes the actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon sequestration in the landscape. The question in this case is, what can agriculture do to help PEI and Canada meet our legislated obligations and our international commitments? So Matt is going to dig into this in some detail, discussing the beneficial management practices that have the most potential to reduce emissions and increase carbon sequestration. And a lot of the new incentive schemes coming out for agriculture are focused on mitigation activities. In particular, this includes the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, increased investment in the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership, SCAP, and the emerging opportunities in voluntary and regulated offset markets, which Sebastian and Thomas will speak to. The other set of actions is focused on adaptation. So adaptation refers to actions that reduce the negative impact of climate change while taking advantage of new and potential emerging opportunities. It involves adjusting policies and actions because of observed or expected impacts of climate change. So the adaptation imperative reflects the reality that no matter what we do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there's decades of climate change kind of baked into the atmospheric system. So I'm going to discuss adaptation at a high level, and we'll take it from there. What are we adapting to? First and most obviously is a changing climate. PEI's Climate Change Risk Assessment, released summer 2021, identifies the following risks specifically for agriculture. We have increasing consequences of post-tropical storms. Dorian and Fiona certainly make that point really clear to us. There is a significant increase in the frequency of heat waves, more frequent and intense heavy precipitation events, like 100 mils within 24 hours, for example. Earlier, warmer springs, which might introduce some opportunity, but often the other side of that is increased seasonal droughts. So while the frequency of seasonal droughts isn't projected to increase, their current impact is considerable, and there's no suggestion that that's going to change. Other impacts include changing pest and disease cycles, particularly when we have less reliable winters. We're not getting kill-off events as consistently as we used to. And then there's increased likelihood of winter kill of forages and winter cereals because the snow cover is not consistent. We have freeze-thaw events and surface ice. There's more work to do in digging deeper into sector-specific climate risks and opportunities, but the risk assessment provides that kind of first really good whole island look at what we should expect. So typically, when we talk about climate change adaptation, the focus is adapting to these climate risks, but I think it's going to be really useful for us to take a step back and consider more broadly adaptation, because we're also adapting to changing consumer preferences. According to Nielsen IQ, 75% of millennials, like the growing consumer demographic, are altering their buying habits to protect the environment. Consumer packaged good companies like General Mills, PepsiCo, and Cargill are positioning themselves by making commitments to source ingredients from farmers and farmland that is managed regeneratively. General Mills commits to 1 million acres sourced regenerative by 2030, PepsiCo 7 million acres, Cargill 10 million acres, Danone, Unilever, Hormel, Target, Land O'Lakes, all making similar commitments. So these are the buyers and processors of the commodities that make the connection to the consumer. Regenerative agriculture, it's really loosely defined, probably subject to greenwashing, which is, I suspect, why these corporates are grabbing onto the term with such excitement. But broadly, it's farming that restores landscape function, builds soil, sequesters carbon, supports wildlife. We're already familiar with a lot of these practices. I think PEI is potentially really well situated to capitalize on this consumer trend because we're already adopting a lot of these practices. We have mandatory rotations, riparian buffers, there's growing attention and adoption to cover cropping, and everybody has a real, honest, authentic focus on soil health, recognizing the agronomic benefits, much less the public benefit. I think these practices, to this point, position our agriculture well going forward, and we're ahead of the curve compared to a lot of different growing regions. We're also adapting to public and corporate policies and priorities. Basically, everybody's setting goals, everybody's setting targets, and a lot of these have a direct impact on agriculture. Canada intends to reduce emissions 40 to 45% by 2030. PEI is committing to working with industry to reduce agricultural emissions by 2040. Dairy Farmers of Canada say that the industry is going to be net zero by 2050. And then I really want us to pay attention to the corporate supply chain targets. These corporations, food processors, retailers are aiming to reduce emissions from the supply chain, which is the food processors and the primary producers who feed into the system. So Walmart wants to remove 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalents by 2030. PepsiCo, Frito-Lay, 40% reduction by 2030. McCain's, 25% reduction in greenhouse gas intensity of raw potato production. And Arla, the largest dairy co-op in the world, targeting a 30% reduction by 2030. So these targets are coming from everywhere: government, industry groups, and the buyers of our commodities. I think this is really a key adaptation priority. And I'm going to wrap up with a few more comments. Often adaptation, mitigation, policy folks love to separate these things as though they're different. In agriculture, they're so interrelated, often the same action can be both depending on your perspective. So let's take nitrogen and the very popular nitrous oxide emissions reduction target. Nitrous oxide is a potent greenhouse gas, almost 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So yeah, we need to reduce nitrous oxide emissions for the public benefit to mitigate climate change. However, we can also frame this as an adaptation action. Nitrogen is expensive. Strategies to use nitrogen as effectively as possible without adversely impacting yields has the potential to decrease input costs and increase profit margins. Profits are key to a farm's adaptive capacity. You know, the margin is the key thing that makes it possible to survive a hit and carry forward. So this nitrous oxide nitrogen target can be framed either way. Similarly with carbon, okay? Before the focus on carbon sequestration, island farmers have had the soil health focus because organic matter increases the ability for the land to support healthy crops, increase water infiltration, holding capacity, and drought resilience. So we can say we're sequestering carbon for the atmospheric benefit, or we can focus on soil health, and really we're doing the same thing, just, you know, framing it slightly differently. The same can be said for livestock feed efficiency. If you provide the animals the nutrition they need at the point in their life cycle when they need it, to the optimum efficiency, you're going to get better growth faster, and a consequence is reduced emissions for the meat or dairy produced. So I think to put a point on this, when we're choosing the next steps in this journey of climate change mitigation adaptation, we have to prioritize the actions that do both activities. The best actions support both priorities, build soil health, increase the farm's adaptive capacity and profitability. And I want to make the point really clear, PEI's farmers are adaptable. If you weren't, you already have been out of business. You are constantly adapting to evolving technologies, crops, market demands, climate conditions, agronomic science, constant change. Those in the room are likely some of the more adaptable because you're seeking information, which is, you know, a key characteristic of folks that have resilience and adaptation to changing conditions. And it's possible that the rate of change is increasing. It seems that way to me and maybe to some people in this room, which continuously emphasizes the importance of focusing on our adaptive capacity and our resilience. And to close up, I'm proposing that climate action, undertaking these actions, can position our industry to meet consumer demands, increase competitiveness compared to other jurisdictions, and potentially take advantage of new systems that pay farmers for ecosystem services like carbon sequestration, which is the focus of the balance of this conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Matt to present some of the strategies to reduce emissions from agriculture.
Thank you, Adam. As Adam said, I think a lot of what I'll present here has just as much value on the adaptive side. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that this is not all about meeting targets. There's market opportunities here, either through the sale of our commodities as they are, but we're also trying to look at this as producing carbon alongside of the crops we grow, which to me represents a new opportunity that has not been fully explored. Which is the forward?
The green button.
The green button, of course. So what I did was, and Adam and I kept in touch over the summer so that we didn't step on each other's toes with respect to mitigation and adaptation, but I wanted to look at whether it was possible to meet our net zero 2030 and 2040 targets, and to do so looking at crop systems and how we're actually farming on PEI. One large number that represents all of agricultural emissions is great, but we need to know where the bulk of those emissions are coming from and what we can do specifically in those areas to help reduce emissions and store soil carbon. So that's just a quick summary of some of the inputs and outputs that I looked at. We relied heavily on a piece of software called Holos. It's a greenhouse gas modeling software. We worked quite intensively with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada to try and get the software to work in a way that reflected PEI conditions, and I think we did get there. So it's provided a tool for us to test not only what we're doing, but new practices moving forward to see what they may yield in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. So by and large, we drove a lot of this by annual crop inventory data produced by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. This is a map, I think it's 2021, just of how many different crops we have and where some of the dominant cropping systems are. And you can see where we grow a lot of potatoes. You can see the forestry in the background. You get a good sense of the diversity and perhaps some of the areas for opportunity. We looked at the top, I think it was top 12 or 20 systems that represented about the 80% of the different combinations of both crops that are in a cropping system, but also the intensity of those crops. So we might have a potato cereal forage with a 1 in 3 year rotation, but there's potato systems with corn in them. Some of them have more potatoes than others. Some have more corn. These all drive greenhouse gas emissions depending on the mix and the intensity of crops. So we really wanted to take a data-driven approach and look at how we are farming. And some of the ACI data was kind of validating itself, because you can see our 3 year rotation for potatoes is still a dominant rotation. I should note the margin of error on the ACI data was about 15%, so we're not getting every single hectare covered, but because there's so many data points covered, we do feel like we're getting a good read on how we're farming. This is kind of a 3D view of all the different cropping systems we looked at going back to 2011. And that allowed us to kind of get a good sense of, we do see some patterns here. We do have a good data set that we can work with and feed that into Holos to figure out if how we're farming on PEI can provide us any insight on how we can start mitigating for 2030 and 2040. So again, that's just something that, just reiterating what I've said, by and large, we're only focusing on CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane emissions. There are other greenhouse gases, but for agriculture, these are the key ones. One other thing I'll note, and you'll see, is that I didn't expect the amount of forages in crop systems have a huge impact on greenhouse gas emissions as per the models. I knew potatoes would represent a distinct greenhouse gas signature, but I didn't understand how much forages would impact the emissions or the expected emissions of a system. So this is all of the systems we looked at from left to right, and we used a permanent forage system as kind of a check to represent the maximum potential of what we think we can store for carbon. So the negative values are actually representing storage or greenhouse gas reduction, whereas the positive values are representing emissions, which we're looking to target. So in this chart, you can see part of our rationale was we want to look at those systems on the right and focus in on what we can do there, because that's where a lot of our emissions potential is going to be. So ultimately, using what we fed into Holos, we were able to produce a map for all of PEI, essentially showing us a bit of a greenhouse gas signature based on crop system, crop intensity, and this allows us, through the federation, through the province, to really hone in on these areas and look at how BMPs can be deployed there to make up a good bulk of the emissions we want to reduce. The other interesting thing was the average 5-year NDVI, so the infrared, mapped up quite well to the greenhouse gas emissions, which again reinforces the importance of forages there. Typically, the forage systems, on average, have more vegetative index associated with them. Again, not unsurprising, but still there seems to be some really strong correlations there. This is the modeled soil carbon, again from left to right. So what I showed before was greenhouse gases. This is actually soil carbon, so we're talking soil organic matter here. This is more of an adaptive look at how some of our systems are performing. And you can see there's quite a spread. Again, with the permanent forage systems representing the biggest potential to add soil organic carbon over time. This is just another view of the same thing, but reiterating the importance of root biomass in cropping systems. Now, again, Holos is a model, so it's not telling us what is actually happening, but it is based on an incredible amount of research and literature that no one person could ever read, so it does provide us with a pretty good indication of what the literature is saying with respect to root biomass. And I do think that this is something we need to think more and more about in our crop systems is the inclusion of perennial forage. So again, it does appear sensitive to our systems. It's not saying everything's the same. There's a lot of variation. We also punched in our total crop inventory numbers as per Statistics Canada and looked at how they mapped up to the national inventory numbers, which are produced by the federal government, kind of an aggregate number telling us what we're emitting as an industry. So we were able to build up those numbers through modeling individual crop systems and crops, which kind of gave us some confidence that the model, again, was going to give us a bit of an indication on where we're at and where we need to get to. And they do add up island-wide. That's the good news, is that there is things we can do. At the outset, we weren't sure whether we'd be way off or whether we'd be way over where we would be. So as a federation, we wanted to look at how we could roadmap our way to 2030 and 2040 based on this information. I mean, it was good to have the information, but what we really wanted to do was look at how we could act on it and move forward as kind of a multi-sector group to achieve these greenhouse gas reductions that we're targeting. So we come up with this roadmap of BMPs. Basically, what we need is about 140,000 tons, but what we've modeled here is about 160,000. So based on the fact that our potato systems represent a significant source of emissions, but also a source of opportunity in terms of reducing nitrous oxide and increasing soil organic carbon, we felt that that was an opportunity because there was so much land area in these intensive systems that if we could deploy cover crops, reduce nitrogen, and some of these other BMPs, that we'd actually get a lot of greenhouse gas reduction out of that just by the sheer volume of land area that we're dealing with. So I think that the four biggest ones that we're looking at are improved beef, cover cropping, improved dairy, and nitrogen reduction. Those are going to make up the bulk of what we're looking at in terms of achieving net zero targets. And a note on the beef and dairy, that's assuming that we're going to have a commercialized access to products like asparagus in the coming years. I know they're kind of in a pre-commercialization phase, but a lot of the literature on Asparagopsis is showing up 50 to 80% reductions in methane. So if we can get that commercialized, a lot of our methane problems could go away quite quickly. And Adam and I have discussed that over the summer, that methane may not be as big of an issue as we thought it was, so long as we can get these technologies deployed. So at the end of the day, we wanted to look at, can we do it? And this is kind of a chart of our aggressive and our minimalist and our average approaches. If we implement BMPs at the volumes that we modeled and predicted, we can get to where we need to be by 2040. But you'll also see that it's quite easy to miss that target if we don't rapidly embrace cover cropping, if we don't figure out a way to maximize nutrient efficiency, and more importantly, if we don't push to get products like Asparagopsis and even sulfur addition to liquid manure, it's going to be very difficult to meet these targets if we don't get those top 4 BMPs covered. So there's a lot more work to do on validating the models and looking at how much more accurate we can get, but we did think this was a good step to look at specific crop systems and and be able to predict if someone comes to the Federation and says, well, I want to try this, I want to do it for this many years, we're now in a position to provide advice on how many greenhouse gas emissions that might reduce or how much soil carbon that may produce. The big thing, though, is we need good farm records. If Sebastian's going to talk more about this, but we're looking at carbon markets as a potential way to fund BMP adoption. So it's not cheap to cover crop. It's not cheap to do strip trialing in fields to figure out where your nitrogen rate should be, and it's not going to be cheap to use Asparagopsis. So we need a financing mechanism to help support this. And our first option was carbon marketing. And I'll not talk too much about it because Sebastian will cover it, but one thing that that I'm seeing in all the work I've done is if you don't have good farm records and we can't track what everybody's doing, there'll be no carbon revenues possible. So it is important to start thinking about the changes that you want to make, but also how you're going to document those changes. And Andrew Mackenzie Gopsel mentioned it in the last session, or the session before last. He mentioned biomass being correlated with ecosystem services and cover crops. Just planting a cover crop's not going to cut it. There's actually certain yields we need to be looking at with respect to cover cropping to make them even store carbon. So there's a lot more detail we need to go into, and a lot more conversation we need to have about how to really push all these BMPs to make sure they're producing what we model them as being able to produce. So I'm going to pass it over to Sebastian now to talk a little bit about the carbon marketing side and how we hope to actually help farmers monetize on the carbon and the greenhouse gases that they do reduce.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, he already covered the first point about this, and that is that carbon markets, growing carbon is an opportunity for farmers. Now, the opportunity is not an old opportunity, it's a new opportunity. So we're talking about emerging markets that are still changing and morphing into new forms, new models all the time. So this is not an established market, so we can't, say like since 20 years this has been the practice. They really have been emerging since early 2000s, and they're still morphing and evolving. And like all other markets that are new, there's quite a bit of volatility in pricing, but they are there. And I would say that since 2020, there has been a real acceleration of consolidation of practices about how people trade with each other. The markets have become more established. Like in Europe, markets have really stabilized in very, very stable pricing models. So I'm going to go over that a little bit, but it is basically to open the whole thing is to say, this is an opportunity and farmers can grow carbon. I mean, it's just a product. It's going to be a product like every other product, and that's the opportunity. There's basically two types of markets. There is the compliance markets and the voluntary markets. And basically the compliance market is a market that government agencies or governments establish certain goals, and they say, here's a compliance market. You have to keep to those goals. Historically, the compliance markets have had trouble taking off because they're a political tool. It needed consensus. There were too many exemptions and too much lobbying from industry in order to get exemptions. So, for example, the European carbon market took a very long time. There was too much supply of carbon credits, not enough marketing, and not enough markets to take up these carbon credits. So the price tumbled to $2 a carbon ton. Over time, these compliance markets have grown in Europe into very, very stable markets. In North America, we're still a bit in their infancy. Some jurisdictions have gone back, like Ontario, established a carbon market, then new government comes in, says we're going to do away with it. So of course that doesn't create stability in the markets, and it's going to create more doubt in the consumer's mind. But if you look at other jurisdictions, they're well on their way. In the future, compliance markets are going to be expected to link up to each other. For example, if you sell carbon credits in the European market, you can't, if you want to sell, if you're a producer in North America and you want to sell carbon credits into the compliance market in Europe, that's not going to be possible. The markets currently are staying within their jurisdictions. Soon they're going to be link-ups, and it's going to be, the barriers are going to come down just like in any other commodity. We're going to have overall, over time, we're going to have trade barriers coming down. The carbon pricing in Canada is a bit all over the place. We don't have a strong federal system. And like Canadians always love to leave things to the provinces. This is the kind of result we have in Canada. We have a combination of carbon tax, carbon credits. There's OBPS, output-based pricing system that the federal government introduced for some top emitters. In PEI, there's only one company that has to pay carbon prices. That's Cavendish Farms. In Nova Scotia, you have a cap and trade system. I think the smartest province, in my opinion, has been Quebec, who very early on linked up with California in a Western Climate Initiative. And a company in Quebec that produces carbon credits can sell into California, which is a top market for carbon credits, because all the top technology companies there are currently buying carbon credits. If you look at the compliance market, this is sort of the map, and it shows the progression of compliance markets in their impact. And you can see how they have been growing. Jurisdiction after jurisdiction are starting to implement their compliance markets. The latest in 2021 was China joining that fray. Now, these are all imperfect markets. I would say that currently the best market is the European trading system. But there's lots of little other markets around, and they're still not that interlinked. But even though you have a compliance market that is growing, to date, you only have 22% of the global greenhouse gas emissions being traded under that market. So lots of scope for growth, and they're growing. Now, people always love to produce these forecast maps, and you have to take them with 2 buckets of salt. But I think the consensus is that these carbon markets are going to grow exponentially in the next 10 years, and they're going to have an increased presence, not just on the farm, but also in all the value chain to your clients, the people you're selling to. They're going to they're going to start looking at carbon markets and maybe kick down, like it usually happens in the value chain, people kick down to the bottom the most volatile parts of the economic opportunity. So you got to watch that.
Sebastian,
Yeah.
any questions? What you've researched, if we're buying nitrogen out of Eastern Europe, is that already taxed? Is that within reach of our nitrogen supply? Is that within reach of the European trading system? Is the carbon tax already applied before that product is shipped to Canada as far as
If they're a producer in Europe, they would abide to the carbon tax in Europe, to the carbon markets in Europe. They would be legislated under the cap and trade system. And if you look at it, just the company that would produce those nitrates would actually fall under that, not in Eastern Europe. This is the European Union. So yeah, Central Europe, yes, not Eastern Europe. So agriculture, if you look at how many carbon credits there are being traded currently for agriculture, this is carbon credits are an emerging market, but in agriculture we are a very, very slim sliver of that current practice. There's only 1% of projects that have to do with agriculture. If you look at the carbon emissions of the whole food system, we're talking about 34%. So when we started talking to experts and saying, let's do a soil carbon project, and Matt already explained PEI actually has good opportunity to do a soil carbon project, they said the basic fundamental problem that agriculture and the food system is facing is how do you feed 9 billion people without mitigating your greenhouse gas emissions. It's impossible to feed 9 billion people and reduce greenhouse gas emissions if you don't have a system in place that compensates the farmer. And what we are trying to do together with the Federation of Agriculture is to find a model that rewards the farmer for doing the right thing. And it's not just morally right thing, it's actually economically the right thing. So lots of scope. Early on, we are probably Within Canada, we're going to be one of the first with a greenhouse gas, with a carbon project, trying to get to market, and the markets tend to reward projects that are a little bit on the rare side. Prices are trending up. So there was, if you look at the carbon prices, I looked at Alberta, Quebec, California, Canada, OBPS, and just as a benchmark, the European carbon market. You can see the European carbon market really is now, it's trading at just below 100 euros. And you can see that Canada, OBPS, and Alberta is moving at the same pace as is Quebec and California because they're interlinked. So the story of this chart basically says the prices are going up and the opportunity is going up and the volume's going up. So it is an opportunity. The voluntary market, these are about compliance markets. The voluntary market is very different. So the voluntary market moves in when the compliance market is not there. Companies decide that they want to build in carbon pricing into their business model before they're being complied to do so. Often companies are voluntarily buying carbon credits, and there's a lot of them. Usually the prices are a little lower than the compliance markets, but lots of creativity is there in the voluntary markets. You can tell more of a story. It's not a pure commodity market. You could say if there's a farmer who wants to do soil carbon project and combine it with a forestry carbon project and build a story around that and make sure there's no leakage, then you really have a strong case for a voluntary market to tell a good story. And just like you all in the market with your commodities, you know that if you tell a good story, you're going to get better prices. And it's not dissimilar in the voluntary market. There's also a sub-segment, and this is how I got to know carbon credits, that is a peer-to-peer, just a bilateral agreement between companies. Could be a small carbon project going to a small company who wants to buy carbon credits. And these can be significantly higher in terms of value than what you get in the commodity market. Now the voluntary market is growing just like the compliance market. Still the volume in the voluntary market is smaller. There's also sectoral initiatives. CORSIA is an initiative by the aviation industry that said by 2020 we're going to cap our emissions, and everything that's being emitted above that has to be traded. Now, 2020, the aviation industry took a dip because of the pandemic, so they haven't been trading a whole lot, and their prices are very low. So it hasn't made an impact, but just like the European carbon market, CORSIA is going to become an important buyer of carbon credits, as will be the shipping industry, who has followed CORSIA in the model, and they're going to establish a similar system where they're going to cap everything that the transportation industry, overseas container, are going to produce. They're going to cap that and trade as well. So lots of sectors are coming in, not just jurisdictions. So the key concept of carbon trading is just a sort of some basics that need to be understood. One is additionality. So if you say, I get a lot of questions from blueberry farmers who say, well, we are maintaining a good biomass on the ground, and we should get carbon credits. Then the answer from the carbon registry would be, you're not doing anything different. You're just growing blueberries. You already have growing blueberries. You're not changing any behavior. So we want to see what are you doing that's going to change in a positive way and going to capture more carbon. So that is the question. It's not what am I doing on an absolute basis, but on a relative basis. That's why there's actually more opportunity in the potato crop system because of the low soil carbon, because you can actually increase it with all the BPMs that Matt talked about. The other thing is the baseline. That's the same argument. Basically, the carbon markets are going to say, here's the baseline. This is standard practice in your industry. We're going to pay you everything that you're going to be doing above that baseline. So for forestry, baseline gets established saying, what's the average practice? Clear cut every 30 years, replantation, that's the baseline. Everything you do beyond that is going to be rewarded. Tom's going to talk more about that. The other thing is permanence. Permanence used to be stronger. People wanted to see that these practices are being done in perpetuity. The markets have stepped away from that because it's hard to enforce permanence. You have to get promises that for the next 100 years you're going to be keeping doing the same thing, and no one can actually promise that. And then another concept is leakage. Just because you're doing good things in your jurisdiction and you are going to outsource the problem to some other jurisdiction is not going to help. So you need to look at it and saying, have you actually done a best practice that's going to capture carbon and that's not going to outsource the problem to another jurisdiction? The life cycle of a carbon offset is basically you have a project developer that works with a project owner. A project owner would be landowner, farmer, to develop a carbon offset project. And they must bring the scientific proof, and that's what all the things that Matt talked about. That's the scientific proof and backup and the data to present the project to a registry. The registry analyzes the project. If it passes, you're going to give green light, and it's going to issue carbon offsets. And these carbon offsets can then be sold in the carbon market. When the offsets are sold, they retire permanently. You have to create new projects. So you can't keep reselling the same carbon that you capture in the soil. Project pathway for PEI. I'm going to skip that slide because I'm telling me wrap it up. But Matt basically talked about there's verification standards that we talked about. VER is a registry. They have developed this methodology, VM0042. And according to that registry, cover cropping, tillage, perennials, job rotation, nitrogen reduction, and improved grazing, those are the things that get rewarded. And this is the things that form the opportunity in PEI. Thank you very much.
So I'll try and go as fast as I can to get everyone done before lunch, and I guess we're kind of switching gears here a little bit. We're going to talk about forests and start to transition away, I guess, from agriculture right before we go to eat. So my name's Thomas Baglow, and I'm a forester, and I am the president of a one-man consulting show based out of Charlottetown called Eastern Forest Solutions, and I'm working with an up-and-coming group called the Sustainable Forest Alliance. And my talk today is called Forest Management, Carbon, and Cooperation on PEI. So the first thing I'm going to touch on is why forests. Why did Adam ask me to come talk at an agricultural convention about forests? Then I'll get into forest carbon projects, so the types that exist, what the Sustainable Forest Alliance is potentially considering, and then move into a little bit about some solid examples of some projects that have been done around North America. And then I'll wrap it up with an intro to the Sustainable Forest Alliance and why we would love to have some farmers join and start to support you on your forest management journey that we hope you're all interested in. So why forests? Prince Edward Island, as you know, has a very ambitious goals for net zero. By 2030, they want to be net zero as related to all GHG emissions from energy production or consumption. And by 2040, it's net zero as related to all GHG emissions. Land and forests, so land that is used for food production and forests that are used for timber production and all other purposes that we have and manage forests for will be have a large role to play in those objectives. It's estimated, I think, nationally and provincially that about 1/3 of emissions reductions will need to come from the land sector, of which forests play a large role. And the three goals that the province has set specifically as it relates to forests is, first of all, to maintain what we have, to grow what we need, and then to invest in early stage technologies. And I'm not speaking on behalf of the province, I'm speaking on behalf of the SFA. And what we're most interested in is maintaining what we have and providing better management opportunities and options to see that moving forward. PEI is blessed with diverse forests. So this is an upland hardwood site, I believe in central Queens County. We have spruce pine forests, we have ash elm forests, cedar forests, spruce bogs, cedar and hemlock forests, and pine forests, and everything in between, all of which kind of prefer different types of management and have different options for landowners. We're dominated by private forests, so I guess the point there is that if the province is to rely on land in any way to meet these objectives, we'll all kind of have to row along in the same direction to some extent. And I guess nationally, globally, and provincially, it's recognized that the forest sector has a large role to play in these emissions objectives or emissions reductions objectives. We can harvest forests and store CO2 in buildings, we can displace fossil fuels, and we can rapidly regenerate any harvested forests and manage and conserve old forests to store carbon and sequester for carbon rapidly. And the province recognizes industry plays a critical role in this. This is our fledgling forest industry that will never surpass the agricultural sector, of course, but we like to think that we could maybe grow and continue to contribute to these objectives. So I'll switch gears from the high level kind of why forests and why I was invited and move a little bit to carbon projects. And as Sebastian really touched on, a carbon project is your way you get a carbon credit to market. So you have a project that would be owned by the landowner and for example, aggregated through someone like the Sustainable Forest Alliance. You have a developer, so someone that lists a project on a registry. They go through all the process, the calculations, they walk it through what's called the third-party verification. And then eventually the registry, they issue those credits, and the credits exist, and then they can be traded on a marketplace. And then someone that buys it would either speculate and trade it again or retire that credit on their balance sheet. Forest carbon projects, as Sebastian touched on, they rely on what's called a baseline scenario and a project scenario. The baseline scenario is what the landowner will do in the absence of the payment for the carbon credits, and the project scenario is what they plan to do moving forward. The general forest carbon project types include improved forest management. So this is to take an existing forest and do something different to either sequester or store more carbon. Avoided conversion, this is to take land that's at the risk of conversion to some other land use and to make some sort of a commitment to halt that conversion. And then afforestation, this is to take bare land and plant trees on it to grow carbon. In North America, improved forest management is the most common forest type or forest carbon project type, that's implemented. There's a number of obvious factors. Our land is too expensive to plant trees on, and for the most part, a lot of our land has already been converted where appropriate. So moving on from the high-level explanation of a forest carbon offset project into the fact that we actually could start one of these today in Prince Edward Island and within Canada. These are three different methodologies that exist. So the one on the left is through what's called the American Carbon Registry, and this is improved forest management on Canadian forest lands. So essentially, these methodologies lay out the calculations and how you argue something like additionality, the verification process, and gives you an estimate of how many credits you might get from a project. The one in the middle is from the Verra registry, or the Verified Carbon Standard, and it's called the Canadian Forest Carbon Offset Methodology. And those two are both to create credits that are sellable in the voluntary markets, as Sebastian touched on. And the one on the right is the 2030 Emissions Reduction Plan from the federal government, and everyone in the forestry community, and I believe the agricultural community, are patiently awaiting a methodology that allows us to create a credit to sell in this market, and they would therefore be kind of compliance grade carbon credits. So moving on from just an explanation of the general project types, then into the types of projects that could be created in Canada, I'll give two examples. One from Quebec that I think the Sustainable Forest Alliance will potentially emulate something like this. We're, again, in the early stages, and we're just going to be looking to take members probably sometime in the coming month. It is a project of landowners in Quebec. And then the one on the bottom is in the American Carbon Registry, and this is in Vermont. So the pivot one on the Verra registry, as I said, it's led by a company called EcoTierra. They're based out of Quebec, and I think most of their work to date until this project has been in developing nations. They're working with various aggregators. So the aggregators would be like different forestry cooperatives throughout southern Quebec that are making commitments within their members to store carbon. They're looking to roll about 15,000 hectares in the next 5 years. And the interesting thing about this Canadian forest carbon offset methodology on the Verra registry is that it allows you to do multiple activity types within one project, and it kind of excites me. So they're doing some project types where the landowner's committing to doing full conservation, switching from a working forest to a conservation forest. They're doing some extension of rotation ages, and then they're doing some afforestation, all of which have different objectives, therefore creating different numbers of credits, essentially. And so I'm not making promises whatsoever on how much kind of revenue exists, because this is in Quebec. They have very different forests. It's a very volatile market. So right now, I think with credits trading at about $15 per ton, these landowners, this grouping of landowners together would be looking at grossing, probably before some of the project expenses, in the range of $60 an acre a year. So then the second one, this is on the American Carbon Registry, and it's in Vermont. It's led by the Vermont Land Trust, a nonprofit called Cold Hollow to Canada, and a number of other groups. It's an aggregation of 10 landowners that collectively own about 8,700 acres. And the important point about this project, again, is that it's in Vermont. They're very productive and nice, tolerant hardwood forests, and very different forest management practices. So our forests today would be in a very different condition than those in Vermont. And it's supported financially by Amazon. And just jumping back to the project out of Quebec, I think they announced some of their first large sale of credits, and it was bought by Dr. Pepper in Canada. So the reason I wanted to bring up the difference in the forests of Vermont as a way you can think about the fact that our projects will look different than these is, first of all, it starts at about 149 tons of CO2 per acre, and their forests grow at about 2.5 to 3 tons per acre per year. So our growth would probably be comparable to some extent, but our starting stocking on average across the landscape would probably be lower in maybe the 80 to 100 tons per acre. And this is just in the biomass pools, so not including something like forest soil carbon. Then what they did, they had to model what's called a baseline scenario. So this is, again, in the absence of the project, this landowner or a future landowner would opt to take that forest and provide a return on investment through essentially liquidation of 50% of the carbon in the next 10 years. Then they forecast forward the project scenario. So the interesting point is the baseline scenario is set in stone, and then the project scenario can change from year to year, but you have to estimate it to get an idea of how many credits are coming. And they estimate that they'll continue to do active forestry and harvest about 50% of the theoretical growth. And it's projected to generate about 445 or 443,000 ERTs, which are emission reduction tons, and that's the name that the American Carbon Registry gives to these credits. And it's sitting at about $75 an acre a year over the first 5 years. So moving on from what a forest carbon project type is and just showing the group here that they exist and people are doing them and there's nothing to stop us from doing one on PEI, I'm moving into the sales pitch component of my presentation where I want to talk a little bit about an up-and-coming organization called the Sustainable Forest Alliance. So we're actually using this as kind of our soft launch. It's the first really public presentation about the group in a number of years, and it's morphed and changed a lot over the years. So the services for people to enroll, it would be similar to any kind of forestry cooperative. You would join and you'd have a woodlot management plan. Any transactions that go on related to your forest, the cooperative would assist you through negotiation and ensuring you get the best bang for your buck if you're doing silviculture or if you're doing any active timber harvesting. We're contemplating something like forest certification. So this is expensive, so it's something we will move slowly on. We would probably consider it if it's either required or has any benefits to the development of the offset project. And then, so I don't know who's been around the forest industry at all on PEI, but there's been a number of attempts at something like a cooperative over the years. And really what sets us apart and makes it kind of more of a viable enterprise is the forest carbon offset aggregation and project development. And then as part of being, good community members and stewards of the forest, we want to collaborate with other organizations. So we've worked with Island Nature Trust a little bit on some projects. And we plan to work hopefully with the Watershed Alliance and the Federation of Agriculture. And then forest sector and market development. So as much as we want to see carbon stored in the forest, we also like to see an active forest industry that could be, a small part of PEI's luckily quite diverse economy. So to end it off here before lunch, why should you join and tell your friends? Work with a trusted partner to monetize your forest's role in net zero. Have access to high quality forestry advice and management services. The Sustainable Forest Alliance wants to unlock the opportunity and the value that landowners hold and provide an opportunity for someone like farmers that are running a business to consider their forest as actually a viable part of their operation. And then, in achieving the province's goals for net zero, you can help put your forest to work for net zero. So why should you join? High quality forest management, verified carbon projects, achieve your goals, and new market opportunities such as the burgeoning carbon offsets. And the Watershed Alliance has been grateful enough to allow us to have a sign-up sheet just to join our mailing list. And as we do go public, we would love to, have some emails on there to explain what membership would look like for someone. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Great. Thanks to the panel for bringing us all that information.